Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 27, Performing Line Edits. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your Project 4 materials, as well as access to your weekly homework document. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll define and explore local edits, we'll examine the rhetorical influence of correct grammar and mechanics, and we'll explore strategies for effectively performing line edits. Let's first define local edits. So recall that revision is broken down really into two camps. We've got local and global level revisions. Now, at this point, we have been focusing on global revisions, right? So we actually just looked at one with argument development, content development, tone, voice, organization. So these are all higher stake concerns that will impact the meaning and persuasiveness of the document as a whole. So remember, if you redefine the purpose of your argument, that's going to influence the type of evidence that you include, perhaps even the reasons that you use to support the thesis or claim that you're making. So we can see how concerns like organization, tone, voice, content development, argument development, how those can impact your piece as a whole. And so we can see where the term global revisions derives from. Now, we are going to look more specifically at local edits. Now, these are lower stake concerns that really only impact the sentence it resides in. So some examples that we'll look at in greater detail here in just a moment would be sentence structure, spelling, subject-verb agreement. So for example, if I decide to change the purpose of my overall argument from saying, okay, rather than just getting people to think a certain idea, I want them to act on it. Okay, we can see how that would change perhaps at least 80% of the content that you've written and how you've laid out that argument. However, if you use a comma instead of a semicolon, you can see how that is not going to require you to go back to the drawing board for your argument in its entirety. Rather, it might just create some confusion with a couple of ideas, on your third paragraph on the 8th page of your text. So it's not to say that local edits are not important. It's just that they typically only impact the sentence they reside in, or perhaps one or two sentences around it. I will say this, and I believe that I have made mention of this suggestion in prior lectures, but it's worth repeating. Local edits should be the last thing you examine. They should be the last thing that you focus in on. Why? Because if you go through, let's say, you've written this entire piece, but you haven't done any of the global edits. You haven't considered, the purpose of your argument. You haven't considered the audience. You haven't considered evidence or organization or anything along those lines. But if you go through and do line edits, yes, you may have mechanically and grammatically a perfect document or a perfect piece of writing, but if the argument doesn't make any sense, if it seems chaotic and disorganized or poorly supported, then yeah, you can have this grammatically correct piece, but your audience still isn't going to understand perhaps the argument that you're trying to make, or they might not feel that it is well supported enough for them to accept or to act upon. So let's say you go back and you redefine the purpose for your argument, or you decide to switch the focus of your audience from one group to another. So that means you're completely writing all over again and you're drafting new materials. So it kind of throws all of the local edits you did at the beginning out the window because you're scrapping a lot of that text. So if you can ensure that your the body of your work is strong, that it speaks to your audience, that it's well supported, well developed, well organized, and you save your local edits for last, then you can ensure that your local edits that you do and that you spend time on are going to go to supporting the final document that you circulate among your audience. Let's now look at specific considerations for local edits. Now, there are more things that we can consider with local edits, but I think in academic writing especially, sentence structure, subject-verb agreement, and spelling are some of the most common foundational local edits that we want to make sure that we can master in our writing. I will say this, that there are specific mini lectures dedicated to each one of these topics. We will be going over each of them in some degree of detail today, but if you would like to learn more about them, and if you haven't watched these mini lectures already, I'd recommend that you do that. First, let's talk about sentence structure. Now, there are a few things that we want to keep in mind with sentence structure. First and foremost, each sentence should clearly communicate one complete thought. Now, we can do this by abiding by clear subject-verb structure, or another way to put it is an actor performing an action. So let's look at this example here. The American Red Cross of Southern Utah serves nearly all of Southern Utah and parts of Arizona and Nevada. So we have a complete thought here because we have an actor or a subject, the American Red Cross of Southern Utah, and then we have an action. They serve or serves. So, which also is our verb in this case. So, and then we have the follow-up. Okay, who do they serve or how do they serve them? So in this case, we've identified who they serve. They serve nearly all of Southern Utah and parts of Arizona and Nevada. So you can see that we've got that complete subject-verb structure there that very clearly represents an actor performing some kind of action. Sometimes when we do not express a thought completely and we don't have a complete sentence there, we get what's called a sentence fragment. Now, these are phrases that don't express a complete coherent thought. Now, they often lack either a subject or a predicate. Now, it's important to remember, let's go back to this example here. So if we were just to say the American Red Cross of Southern Utah serves, okay, yes, that can technically be considered a complete sentence, but it also can give off vibes of being a fragment because, okay, who do they serve? It leaves the reader wanting more. So this is some terrain that you'll want to be especially cautious of, that you are explaining the verb in its entirety, and that's what allows us to develop a predicate. So for example, last summer, though the area saw one of the most intense fire seasons in recent memory. Okay, so we can definitely tell how this qualifies as a sentence fragment. We don't really have a clear subject, nor do we have a verb or a predicate. So we are left to wonder who is doing what. So we look at it this way. If we revise it to include a subject and predicate, last summer, though the area saw one of the most intense fire seasons in recent memory, the American Red Cross still performed their services for those in the area. So we have our subject here, the American Red Cross, and then we have the predicate, performed their services for those in the area. So we've got the verb there, and we've got exactly how that verb is carried out and who is impacted by that verb. The next type of incorrect sentence structure we want to look at will be a run-on sentence. Now, that's when a sentence contains more than one complete idea without proper punctuation. So, for example, we could say the American Red Cross has served the area for decades. They often even assist local emergency responders during other emergencies. Okay, so we have two complete thoughts in one sentence. So a common way to correct a run-on would be just to say, okay, well, where do I see my other subject emerge? So we have the American Red Cross and they. Those are our two subjects that are performing different actions. So we can at that point say, okay, well, they is sort of a new subject that's performing a new action, and is the start of a new thought. So that's where I will put a period. That is where I will start my next sentence. So, the American Red Cross has served the area for decades. Period. New sentence. They often assist local emergency responders during other emergencies. So we can see how there is two complete thoughts being expressed here. And okay, so the next that we'll want to look at, a type of incorrect sentence structure would be a comma splice. Comma splices are a type of run-on sentence that connects two complete sentences with only a comma. So we see here, during a standard blood drive, the American Red Cross collects hundreds of pints of blood, comma, they then return these donations to the headquarters in Las Vegas. So we can see that there are two complete thoughts here, two complete sentences. We've got the American Red Cross collects hundreds of pints of blood. They then return these donations to Las Vegas. So we have two complete thoughts, but they are connected only by a comma. Remember that it's not against the rules to connect two complete independent thoughts, and combine them into one sentence. But we just want to make sure that we're doing this properly. So we've already seen an example of how we might do that, in this prior sentence, because we've made, essentially this run-on into two separate sentences. But there are ways, if we want to express that there is an explicit relationship that should be defined for our audience between these two ideas, we aren't restricted to just creating two sentences. So for example, we could say, during a standard blood drive, the American Red Cross collects hundreds of pints of blood, comma, and we're using the comma conjunction. And, comma, and they then return these donations to the headquarters in Las Vegas. We could also say, comma, so, comma, but, comma, for, or whatever kind of conjunction works. We can also use a semicolon and a transition. So we could say, semicolon, therefore, they then return these donations, semicolon, however, they then return these donations. So if you find that there are two ideas, that you've connected, especially, and typically, writers will use, or employ a comma splice when they want to show that two ideas should be related, or the reader should understand them as being related in some way, shape, or form. But of course, comma splices can cause confusion because they might indicate that something is an item in a series, or, just by using the comma, they don't know how to interpret, the relationship you're trying to establish. I mean, we can even look at the corrected example. If I decided to use comma but instead of comma and, the reader could very reasonably read that sentence in a different light, rather than saying, oh, okay, this is a sentence indicating sequence. First they do this and then they do that. We could read it as, but they then return the blood to Las Vegas and they don't keep it in St. George, or they don't take it to Mesquite. So we can see how the careful selection of the word that we use, be it a conjunction or a transition word, to connect these two complete sentences, we really do want to be careful there, because that can influence, and often does influence, the ways in which our audience will understand the relationship among those ideas. Moving on now to subject-verb agreement. Now, this is ensuring the singular plural nature of your subjects and verbs align. Easiest thing to remember it, if a subject is singular, its verb must also be singular. If a subject is plural, its verb must also be plural. So, the dogs benefit from the enrichment toys. The dogs benefit from the enrichment toy. So we have two different examples here. We have the correct one on top, the dogs benefit. So because our subject is plural, we see that the verb benefit is also represented as plural as well. But here we have on the bottom, the dogs benefits from the enrichment toys. From this, we've got a plural subject, but we've got a singular verb and they don't align. Now, I know this can be rather confusing because we look at it and we'd say, well, with the second one, they both have S's on the end. And oftentimes a good way to remember that is if your subject has an S on the end, like we see on the top sentence, the dogs, your verb will not have an S on the end. So I could say the dog benefits. So I have a singular subject. The dog does not have an S on the end, but my verb to indicate it is speaking to a singular subject will have an S on the end. So that's kind of a good way to remember it, that typically there has to be an S there somewhere, either regardless of whether it is attached to the subject or the verb. And I mean, the same could be said, if we were to say the dog benefit from enrichment toys, obviously that doesn't sound correct. So with subject verb agreement, you just want to make sure that, there is an S on either the subject or the verb in this case. So the girls run, the girl runs. So just keep that in mind as you are going throughout. And it's also important to remember what specifically is your subject, especially if you have a long, complex sentence that you're writing. If you are, wondering, okay, well, should I add an S to the end of this verb or not? And maybe you've got a few clauses peppered in between your subject and your verb, so you have some sort of thought sprinkled in between. Just ask yourself very simply, who is the actor of this sentence? Is that actor singular or is it plural? And how does that influence the way in which I've presented the verb? Spelling. Okay, so this is going to be important. Ensure first and foremost all names are spelled correctly. This is especially important for your sources. Make sure that you are not only citing all of your sources correctly, but that you're spelling the names correctly. Go through with a fine-tooth comb, compare the ways an author spells their name as it's presented on the text that you're citing, and ensure that you have that spelling included correctly in your text. This is also going to be important for any, places that you cite, groups, anything along those lines. Also, you'll want to keep a close eye out for homophones. So there, and there. It's and it's, to and to, bye and bye, who's. So with these, we go into detail on many of these in the mini lecture. So if you'd like more information on them, I'd recommend checking out the mini lecture for more detail on that. But these are some of the most common spelling errors, especially in academic writing. So familiarize yourself with homophones especially, and make sure that you are using the correct spelling of a particular word. So because if I say, okay, there are 2 pencils available for students to use, I don't want to use there are TO pencils or TOO pencils. I want to say TWO pencils, especially if I am indicating, a numerical value of pencils available. Also, because I know that writing strategies are changing, I know a number of writers, heck, myself included, that when I just get an idea, I like to whip my phone out and just basically text it to myself or write it on a note in my phone and then return to it later. But I've also seen some writers who will just have Google Docs open on their phone or their tablets. While that can be incredibly helpful, you of course want to keep an eye out for autocorrect. This is also important with Word and Pages as well, and other word processing programs, because sometimes they'll assume that you mean one word when you really mean another. So just ensure that autocorrect has not changed the word in its entirety if you do have some kind of corrective program installed on the device that you are composing on. Now let's talk about strategies for performing these line edits. We've talked about major considerations when we should perform line edits in comparison to when we should perform other type of revisions throughout our composition process. So when we think about strategies, okay, how can we go about performing line edits in the most effective way possible? Now, this is going to vary from one person to the next, but some of the most common and popular strategies are, first and foremost, read your text out loud. Read it as if you were giving a speech to someone. This works because you can often hear things that your eyes don't catch. You can hear a sentence if it's wonky. You can hear, if your subject and verb disagree. You can hear if you have a run-on sentence, or perhaps if you have incorrect comma placement. I'd also recommend reading your text backwards. This can help with things like spelling, because you can go through and say, oh, this is the noun that the word to is modifying, but I'm obviously using the incorrect form of to here because I've used to instead of two. So reading your text backwards can give you a sense of what kind of words should come before the word that you're on to allow the audience to best understand your meaning of it and your use of it. This one is a bit tedious, but I promise, especially if a paper is of utmost importance, reading syllable by syllable. This can help with spelling especially, but also ensuring that your sentence structure and your sentence rhythm will read well on your reader's end or on the end of your audience. So literally that would be: read your text out loud. Read your text backwards. Read syllable by syllable. Track all changes made either on a digital or physical copy. So, like I said, it is redundant. It can be kind of a pain sometimes, but I will say I've used this method even on lengthier works, and it has helped me catch some issues that could have been detrimental to my writing otherwise. It could have influenced a misunderstanding in certain ideas I wanted to communicate. It helped me clean up my writing so it didn't look sloppy, especially in terms of if I misused a punctuation, or if I used the wrong word as I was very hastily typing something out to get a thought down on paper. And I always recommend keep your receipts in one way, shape, or form. Track all changes that you make either on a digital copy or physical copy. So again, this is going to vary from one person to the next. Some folks really love using Google Docs as a way to track the changes that they do. Others prefer printing them out, printing their drafts out, and just keeping a folder, a literal physical folder of all of the drafts that they've kept. So this can help you understand how your work has changed over time, but it can also be a good sort of repository for writing that you might not have seen purpose for initially, but maybe you say, okay, well, in my first draft, I had this idea. I didn't really like it during the second draft, but now I'm on my third or fourth, and I'm starting to see where this could fit in. So when you go through and you track all of those changes, you make it easier for yourself to, re-enter text if you find it appropriate. It can also help you identify patterns of areas that you would want to work to improve on in other instances of writing. So maybe you go through and you say, wow, I really got to keep an eye out for the there homophones. I really have to keep an eye out for sentence fragments, because maybe those, as I track my changes, were the most common issues that I needed to focus on during the last project or the last writing assignment. So these can help you in the long run because they can help you see, okay, where are some areas that I've certainly demonstrated that I'm strong on, and where are some areas that I can continue to learn more about. So for your lecture assignment, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to review the materials you currently have for Project 4. Based on the feedback you've received in the past, both in this course and others, be it English 1010, be it, writing feedback you received from your chemistry professor or your theater instructor, what are 3 things you will keep a close eye out for while performing line edits? How do you think this will improve your final submission of Project 4, and how do you think the methods mentioned will help you edit successfully? Your response should be no more than 50 words, so this is very brief and to the point reflection, and it should produce some very actionable ways that you can revise and polish your Project 4 materials. All right, weekly homework. Be sure to include your Core Lecture 27 summary and assignment in your Week 14 homework submission. Overall, Week 14 should include the summaries and assignments for Core Lectures 26 and 27, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. Your Week 14 homework materials are going to be due to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, November 24th. And all right, folks, I actually looked at the calendar right before I recorded this lecture, and this is our last core lecture for the semester. So I will still be available. Please take Thanksgiving off. No core mini lectures, no prep materials. Have a wonderful time with friends and family. Enjoy it for the wonderful fall break that it is. And then please remember that you will need to take the final assessment and turn in your Project 4 materials during the final week of instruction. So review the course calendar, see what our last couple weeks will look like and how you are going to design and approach that workload. But of course, if you have any questions or would like to discuss any of these concepts in greater detail, or if you have any questions or concerns regarding the last couple weeks of the semester, please do not hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, I'll see you later.